This is Chapter 17, World War II, Discussion Number 3, The Collapse of the Reich. Even after Hitler attacked Poland and started World War II, the United States did what it could to stay out of this European conflict. And remember, the United States had on the books the Neutrality Acts, which forbade them from selling weapons of war to warring countries. However, FDR came up with a plan in order to try to worm his way around the Neutrality Act by asking for and getting the Lend-Lease Act. The idea that they would loan weapons to Britain in order for that Britain would be able to withstand the German onslaught, but with the understanding officially that Britain would return the weapons after they were done with them. Roosevelt had essentially equated as if your neighbor's house is on fire, you're not going to demand payment to loan them a hose in order to save their house. Hitler was also causing lots of other problems. And so Churchill and Roosevelt, even before the United States entered the World War II, claimed the Atlantic Charter. It was their promise and their goals for the end of World War II in the same way that Wilson had wrote out his 14 points. What was going to be their goals at the end of World War II? They promised that they would seek the destruction of Nazi tyranny and the right of all peoples to choose the form of government for which they were going to live under. But the United States remained out of World War II. That is, until the Japanese struck. The United States stopped selling the raw materials of iron, steel, and oil to Japan after they assumed control of the East Indies and French Indochina. However, that wasn't enough. The Japanese were insulted by this idea that the United States would consider that their assumption of these raw material sources was inappropriate, and they were afraid that the United States would interfere into their plans to establish their dominance over the Pacific Rim. And so the Japanese attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor to prevent the United States from interfering in their plans for the rest of the Pacific Rim. The United States then declared war on Japan. Because of the Tripartite Act, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, and then the United States declared war on Germany and Italy. The Allies, especially of Great Britain and the United States, along with the Soviet Union, committed to a total war effort. Several civilian factories were converted to make war materials. In fact, for 3 years during World War II, absolutely no civilian cars were built, as they were all converted to airplane factories, tank factories, jeep factories, and anything else factories that the United States needed. Prices and wages were regulated. Rationing was instituted by the use of stamp books. Women went to work in the factories in order to continue the productivity while men prepared to go to war. One of the biggest ideas during World War II was the use of airplanes during battle, especially naval warfare. World War I, battleships were the number one ship for conflict. However, battleships became drastically outdated with the use of naval air power, which was able to extend, whereas the battleships would be able to extend power, say 50 miles, is if the greatest weapons could fire. I think 50 is a bit long there, but I'm guessing. Hundreds of miles would be able to be controlled by aircraft carriers with their airplanes. The Japanese were able to be stopped as far as their expansion into the Pacific areas, both at the Battle of Coral Sea, which stopped their advance in the Indonesia-Australia territories, and the Battle of Midway was the stopping point. The Japanese got no further in the Central Pacific. The Tehran Conference brought together Churchill, FDR, and Stalin, where Stalin again was begging the British and Americans to start a fight in Western Europe, because at this point Stalin was facing the entire German army around Stalingrad and Leningrad. Churchill and FDR said that they were working on it, they were planning on it, but they didn't have their resources together yet. Meanwhile, the British were beating the Germans and the Italians out of North Africa. American General Dwight Eisenhower was given overall command of all the Allied forces in Western Europe as they were preparing to invade Europe to defeat Germany. However, Germany saw that they needed more raw materials, especially oil, and so they aimed for the Soviet Union's southern oil fields around Stalingrad. Besieged and then with house-by-house combat, the Soviet Union was able to outlast the German attack. They were also able to surround the German army and force them and started pushing the Germans back through Eastern Europe. Meanwhile, while the Soviet Union was starting to get the upper hand against the Germans in Eastern Europe, Allied troops left Great Britain and invaded Europe across the English Channel. They started pushing back the Germans on D-Day. During this invasion, the big three of Churchill, FDR, and Stalin met together in Yalta. Churchill, FDR, and Stalin met, and promises were made as far as who would get what territory, and to keep Stalin happy, so long as Stalin promised that once World War II was over, Stalin would give all of those territories conquered free elections. Soviet Union and the combined forces of Britain and the United States were able to essentially squash Germany between them, and they completely conquered Germany in May of 1945. In May 8th, 1945, a few days after Hitler had committed suicide, Germany's new leaders surrendered. They were able to do this, especially the Americans and the British, despite the last German offensive in the winter of 1944, which is famously known as the Battle of the Bulge. This concludes discussion number 3, the collapse of the Reich.